Hello and welcome back to IEC 2021 from Aston University. Next, for our keynote on research into enterprise education and practice, I'm delighted to welcome Drs. Emily Beaumont, Kelly Smith and Breda O'Dwyer.
Hello, we're going to be talking today on the Rent Ed special SIG, and we're going to be starting with Breda, if she's there.
I am here, but I don't know if you can see me or hear me.
Right, Breda, off you go then, if you can, with our presentation.
Okay, if Daniel could share, that would be great. This is an interesting exercise, folks. I'm based in Ireland, you're there, and somewhere our slides are somewhere. So welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about our SIG, which I have to say and be very open and honest, was initiated by both Emily and Kelly, who had the vision to see the value, I guess, of what was initially the COI and is now, delighted to say, the fastest growing SIG group at ISB. So it's essentially was established to really look at researching into enterprise education and practice and how the two should meet. So as we move on to the next slide, I guess looking at essentially, it was launched with EUK, the Research Enterprise Education SIG, together with ISB. We're looking at what it is that from an education perspective, and I guess to build on the shoulders of those who've gone before us and to create a legacy and to very much create pathways for future research and where it can even build further on upon that. So looking at also, I guess, the very good, long-established positive relationship that exists and has existed and continued to exist between ISB and the EUK, formalising, I guess, that whole discussion space that we're very open to having, very open, honest, frank discussions that you've heard of up to today in this conference and indeed the ISB conference and in between the conferences. But what we really want to look at in this particular SIG was to focus on education. We could have a debate here on the whole Latin definition of what is education, but fundamentally it was really to look at how can we build and enhance our education of what essentially has been presented to us by Europe and the OECD, saying it is up to us in the further and higher education sector to very much develop and cultivate the entrepreneurial thinking citizens of the future. It didn't say that they were a particular sector. It said simply it was our responsibility to very much drive this forward. So with that, this SIG is very much looking at research on that whole education space. As I mentioned earlier on, this was very much the brainchild of both Emily and Kelly. And as my role as the VP of Entrepreneurial Learning and Practice and now, which I took over from Kelly, I am delighted to be the co-chair of this SIG with Dr. Emily Beaumont as well. So looking, I suppose, more behind that then, as we move on to the next slide, and looking at what it might be in terms of the actual aims behind this SIG group. Again, it's just to look at education practitioners to provide and encourage people to get involved in this area. Yes, entrepreneurship literature is evolving. Yes, entrepreneurship education research is evolving. We really want to impress more that we look at beyond the pedagogy and to link this in with the practice. So to develop and facilitate the development of these research projects between different researchers and practitioners. So what that means is that we're looking at developing and creating a platform and a community of practice. And Emily will speak more to that, and indeed Kelly, as I hand over in a few moments. And I guess also to host the activities where people can meet and share openly and honestly and critique our sharing of this knowledge between the experts in the areas, and to be very proud of who we are as the educators of this particular space and the influence and the impact we can have in what we do, deepen that research and very much progress as our role models in this area. And therefore, to create this SIG, to very much look as an expert group that will inform policy responses and calls for evidence, and that we can stand over the evidence we have and therefore influence policy going forward. I can honestly say we've started off very well in this process. So as we move on to the next slide and looking at, from the point of view of where it is and what we do as a SIG. So as I said, we promote research. We're looking at that research being very innovative in its approach. It doesn't necessarily have to be a standard, process which is, qual or quan, but very much looking at alternative ways of capturing that information through video analysis, through various different media, audio, and looking at alternative methodologies to collect, analyse, and very much share and present that evidence. But fundamentally, I guess, to give early career researchers, more and more are moving into this space. I think we're also seeing people getting involved in this that are coming from other disciplines beyond the School of Business, beyond that business background. So we are there to very much encourage these early career researchers to use their innovative approaches and to bring that to us in this forum and to shape and to drive where we are in terms of our joint interests as both EUK and ISB in this space. Again, we have a very good foundation and we want to very much drive that forward. And I suppose in doing that, as I said at the beginning, to build on the shoulders of the giants who've gone before us and to look at using that mentorship and that governance that exists at the moment in EUK and ISB from those trustees and directors, and to very much, I suppose, ask them to share their experience with us and to have that inform some of the research proposals that we are looking at and that will be going forward. And on that basis, to build on the excellence of that reputation that we have and to be very much seen as the key go-to when it comes to informing policy and very much looking at from the educational perspective across Europe and beyond, that this grouping will be very much the leaders in the sharing of the latest knowledge in that space because of the research that we're doing. And therefore, in doing that, to support the next generation that will exist beyond us and beyond others, and then sharing that information as we move on. So I guess with that, that's what it was set up. Delighted to be the co-chair at the moment, Emily, but I've got to say that Kelly's a very strong partner in this process as well. So it's very much great to have that shared mindset happening between us and looking at developing it. So to share with you now as to where we have come from, what has happened, I'm going to hand over to Emily to share that with you. So there you go, Emily.
Breda, so now we just want to put up a few of the events and activities that we've been doing over the last couple of years. It all started off really well, as you can imagine, pre-COVID. We had a number of events in person, some fantastic workshops with some brilliant partners, not just here in the UK, but over in Ireland as well. Then we had to put things on pause for a certain amount of time due to COVID and move things online, which we did quite successfully when we had an international event with international speakers from Australia and again from Ireland, I think, that we had at that particular event. What's been fantastic is the Rent Ed SIG has enabled us to work collaboratively and start to build some projects which are part of the SIG that have a really strong relationship with the SIG. And one of those projects Kelly is going to talk to you a little bit more about. And finally, we're making sure that we are strongly represented in the conference tracks, both here at IEC, but also at ISB, whose conference is still to come this year, if you wanted to come and see the education track at the ISB conference. So the looking forward, it's a rather sort of bleak diary at the moment, and we're turning to our SIG members and sort of saying, right now, we're post-COVID, we're back, we can meet in person, but we also know we're pretty good at online events now. What do you want us to do? Where would you like us to go? And who would you like to see talking? Or what sort of projects do you want to see? We've got a few things lined up. We know that we are going to be looking at the future of research in enterprise and entrepreneurship education. And that's going to spin out from the project work that Kelly, Breda and I have been doing. And we have obviously an extension of our project in terms of looking at an international element of it. But we want our SIG members to become involved much more and make sure that they can draw upon the SIG to support them in the work that they do. So if you are not already a SIG member, then please become one. And you can do that by going to the website, ISB's website, and going to their special interest group page. It'll tell you lots of information about the special interest group. The link is there in the slide. Sorry, it's not an easy, nice one to remember, but hopefully you can jot it down in time, or just Google Rent Ed SIG with ISB. As Breda said, it's the fastest growing SIG as part of ISB, so come and join us, but more to the point, come and get involved. Tell us what you want to see as part of the SIG, tell us what you want to do, and EUK and ISB together will make something happen with that SIG. So now I'm going to hand over to Kelly, who's going to speak more specifically about one of the projects that we've been doing.
So this is a project I was really inspired by a paper Emily found and was found quite controversial and thought to be a really good discussion piece. So it's a paper by Rattan and Usmanij, forgive me with the pronunciation of the surname there. The link is on the slides if you're interested to go and read it for yourself. The main findings were, their main recommendations and conclusions were that many research opportunities are still to be discovered. So this space is ripe for us to be part of. Enterprise educators, researchers need to continue to find innovative teaching methods and develop critical thinking skills. I think we have some critical thinking skills already, but we can improve those together as a community. Future research areas are subjective and determined largely by the attitudes of the researcher towards the topic. And I think for me, this is a really important point. We sometimes think of us as researchers and educators as being very separate. I think Emily, myself and Breda would consider ourselves to be educators and researchers together. But a lot of the published research we'll see, and we'll come on to this in some of our initial findings, tends to assume that enterprise educator researchers are based in business schools. We're bigger than that, we're more than that, and I think our voices need to be heard further. They recommended a shared agreement with students on specific outcomes. They say that few studies predict future learning scenarios for entrepreneurship education and how to improve learning effectiveness. And again, for me, this is where a space such as IEC is so important, because here we hear what people are looking at, the emerging topics, and we are at the forefront of what will be happening in the future again. Rattan and colleague was particularly excited about potential new teaching methods in enterprise education and how critical thinking improves learning outcomes. And again, as we see here, I'm always inspired by what's presented at IEEC in terms of those new teaching methods and innovative practice. So moving on to the next slide. So what did we do? So again, Emily found this paper, Breda and I were inspired by it as well, or inspired by what we could do with it, what was needed to be done further. And so we came up with the idea of looking at the thought leader experiences and what thought leaders in the UK within the enterprise and entrepreneurship education space felt about research and what was needed. So we engaged with 15 enterprise educator thought leaders, and we collected our thought leaders from EEUK board and ISB board and other people who were published in the areas. And we also tried to get the views of an early career researcher researching into entrepreneurship education. I'm not going to say all 15 names here, but you will recognise the names. And I'm sure on the chat, if anyone is in the room, they'll be quite happy to put your hand up and say you were a member of this study and you were a thought leader. We used quite a rigorous way of collecting our data that we were then going to analyse in this project. Some of you may be familiar with the Delphi methodology. And so we kind of adapted and used a Delphi-like methodology, again, to try and put some rigor around these conversations. So we had our 15 enterprise and entrepreneurship thought leaders. We asked them to read the paper as a provocation, not to agree with it necessarily, but to use, or disagree with it necessarily, but to use it as a starting point for these conversations to be had. Each participant was asked to provide a commentary. All of those comments were submitted anonymously, and at this point, no thought leader was aware of who else was in the group. Was in this collection. They were put into groups. One thought leader was given all the comments of that group, and then would respond and add in further comments, and then we passed through the group. So we came up with a fair amount of data. A fair amount of conversation and discussion as far as was possible using this particular methodology. And so we conducted the initial analysis, and I'll go on in the next few slides to explain what our three key findings were. So our first finding was that it was around the purpose of enterprise and entrepreneurship education. What is our purpose as a discipline? So we may feel we know as a community exactly what enterprise education and what entrepreneurship education is. But I know from my own personal perspective, I have multiple hats. One day I consider myself more of an enterprise educator and some days more of an entrepreneurship educator, and that can be quite confusing. And it can be really quite complex. So when we're trying to describe our purpose to others, that can be difficult again. Now, to a certain extent, we have decided as a community, we know what enterprise education is, we know what entrepreneurship education, we can move on and have further conversations. So we've effectively parked that issue in some ways, and we may not be addressing it in any particular depth, again, because of the multiple purposes and contexts. So we need to do more again, I think, and this is coming through. We need to be clearer on those distinctions and what our actual purpose is. Next slide. The second one we had is because potentially of this lack of purpose, clear purpose, we may not necessarily be very distinct. And again, there is a view, and again, you'll see this come through in government policy documents, for example, the Lord Young Review from 2014, that the general assumption is enterprise and entrepreneurship education comes out of business schools and research also comes out of business schools. Now, again, we know that's not necessarily the case as practitioners in this space. But I think we need to push forward and recognise that we are beyond the business school in research as well as in our practice. Next slide. Thank you, Dan. And then the final one that came through, and this was quite controversial in the discussions, and we're having to revisit this at some depth, was the idea that we may be haunted by dated theories in our space. We may be using concepts and mental models that have been developed for many years ago. Now, some of those concepts, mental models and theories are absolutely right and current and still have a lot of usefulness. Others possibly not. And this is both in terms of our practice as educators and also in our research. And so we need to have a look at the theories, concepts, and mental models in more detail to really be sure of which are current and which need to adapt and move on. Next slide. So what we're doing now, we're obviously presenting here to you today. We are drafting a working paper to present to the ISB conference, having done a more rigorous analysis. We're also submitting to other conferences. And we're going to be using the findings to help support our SIG, to help the community to address that interaction between education and research going forward. I think that may be our last slide.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. So we've got time for probably 2 or 3 quick questions. If anyone any delegates in the audience have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A tab. I know I fielded one earlier, and that was, do I have to be an experienced researcher to get involved in the SIG?
Absolutely not. We welcome anybody with any amount of experience to the SIG. We want that range of experience there because we want to create a little ecosystem where we can collaborate and help and develop people in their various research interests and projects as they go along. So yeah, please don't feel that you don't have enough experience, and please don't feel that you're far too experienced to come and join the SIG. We will welcome anybody who has an interest in research in enterprise and entrepreneurship education.
Can I just add into that? Because I think it's really important to recognise that it's that conversation which really drives the research and our practice forward. Educators, when I put my educator hat on, I will come up with ideas that I want tested, I need tested, and I will also have access to subjects and data. that a researcher may not have. If I put my researcher hat on, then I may have skills and the research skills, the analytical skills that I can then bring forward to explore. So I think those conversations are really important. So personally, I mean, I'm no longer part of the SIG officially, but for me, it's really important to have that sharing and discussions linking the research and the practice together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super, thank you. And someone else asked, what are the outdated theories that we are haunted by?
That's a really good question. And when we were looking back at the data more specifically that from the thought leaders, there wasn't actually any particular pointing out of particular significant models, theories, frameworks, thoughts around, in particular. There was this general feeling that the community still relies on a number of these, and actually we need to perhaps just go back and revisit them. That's not to say, as Kelly said earlier, that we need to throw them out and do away with them. Absolutely not. We just need to make sure that they are still relevant, and perhaps an evolution is in process and progress at that point in time.
And based on the findings to date, how are you changing your own work?
Wow, that's a really good question, actually. A lot, actually. It's making us, well, I can't speak for my fellow colleagues, but it's certainly making me look at what I'm undertaking research on in enterprise and entrepreneurship education, how, who's involved, and now looking at it from so many angles to make sure that actually it's making me sort of check what I'm doing. I don't know how Breda and Kelly feel around that as well. Breda?
I suppose, again, following on from what Emily's saying, very much kind of chatting, I guess, methodologies that we use. Let's walk the walk. We often talk about creating the innovative mind and the entrepreneurial mindset, but quite often perhaps we're not being typically very innovative ourselves in the collecting and analysis of data. So I'm certainly dipping into other fields to extrapolate some of the methodologies that we can use. I think, dare I say it, even our approach in our own process here is quite innovative in using the Delphi technique, and it's been very, very informative for us. And I think also maybe it's from my perspective, I think at least, is that really to understand the fact that it's not about us pushing entrepreneurship to other disciplines. It's about us being able to extrapolate the entrepreneurial mindset within those other disciplines and to really kind of bring it that way forward, as opposed to us pushing, which is pretty, for quite often has been seen as being how we've put out there entrepreneurship stroke enterprise education, that we force it upon other disciplines and therefore it becomes one outcome and one outcome only, i.e. setting up an enterprise. So for me, my confidence has very much been increased in the ability to refute that and to very much extrapolate it further from other disciplines. So that would be from my perspective. So I'm certainly seeing the fruits of that labour.
And for me, thinking about me as a practitioner, I found myself really questioning when I present theories, are these still relevant, even that heightened criticality, I think.
That's it. Thank you. And Diana asks, what are the new theories coming through?
Oh, again, another good question. Well, puts me on the spot a little bit, that one.
Well, I think one of the things we have been living through is COVID, and I think what we will be doing is reassessing with real purpose now which of those theories and concepts are still relevant and adapting them to our new reality. Or not. We may find, as far as the business world is concerned, that the same concepts, the same experiences persist. Mm-hmm. So I think we're in a really interesting position for all of us together to explore what those new theories are going to be.
If I could just say,
and we're sort of zoomed out looking at that topic of research and enterprise and entrepreneurship education, not necessarily doing that element of research and entrepreneurship education. That our subject is the sphere of research and entrepreneurship education. So it's we're kind of there to sort of say what's happening, and then hopefully offer some guidance, some thoughts for the future on that topic.
And if I could just say as well, I guess what we're also finding is that this concept of you do or do not have an entrepreneurial mindset is in fact not the case. So new theories would suggest that this is actually, the binary outcome is something we're very much challenging and questioning, because there's a whole continuum aspects, and even building on the theory of the ONT-COMP framework that Alison spoke of, that we could actually start looking at the entrepreneurial mindset tool that might be brought forward. So there's indeed a lot of theories that are evolving. But again, even let's look at AI. Could we bring artificial intelligence into this space where we could actually become more neuro-informed as to what develops the entrepreneurial thinking process, and perhaps look at that from an AI perspective? So the theories that are evolving are very exciting indeed.
The other exciting things, and Breda hasn't said this herself, but Breda's own research is looking at the enterprise educator and the entrepreneurial mindset of the enterprise educator and entrepreneurial role models for the educator. And so I think Breda herself is going to be developing some really interesting theories and concepts that have more relevance to us as educators and academics in this space.
Thank you. And we've got time to take these last two on the board briefly, I think. Andy asks, what do you think of the ICSB Education Manifesto written by Norris Kruger from a primarily US perspective?
Well, I don't know. What do you think of the ICSB education? I'm afraid that's a little too specific for me at the moment, Andy. Thank you for throwing us a really great question there.
Yeah, Andy, if you put a link in the chat, I'll let you know later.
Yeah, we'll give you a full debrief, Andy, at that point. One
to take a look at, I think, for all of us. And then could you kindly tell us about some of the theories categorized as dateless?
I think that's something we've just had a go at answering a few minutes ago, very close to that one. So yeah.
Final one then, have you seen the other areas that you're trying to extrapolate from using different language? So maybe that can be a barrier. I find that working with creatives.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it's a big thing for me that in my practice previously, we never used the word entrepreneur. They exist and they're there, and we're being waved at, we need to move on.
Thank you very much. That's been an excellent session on research into enterprise education and practice with Drs. Emily Beaumont, Kelly Smith and Breda O'Dwyer. I'm going to take a couple of minutes now, and then we'll be back with the National Enterprise Education Awards with John Powell and Emma Forzan.